Hello, this is Dr. Kalman Andrassy again, and today I'm going to discuss how to put together a literature review as part of a research proposal or a research paper. And of course, I am basing it on my rubric for each of my classes in putting together such a literature review. So the first thing that I want to talk about before we move forward is pointing out that the literature review is not an annotated bibliography. All right, so almost every semester in nearly every program that I teach in, somebody goes and submits an annotated bibliography rather than a true literature review. So first and foremost, I welcome everybody to go ahead and, as you're doing your research on putting together the literature review, read how the individuals in the articles that you download from a website or any articles that you see in a journal itself, how they put together a literature review section and essentially seek to mimic that. I am not looking for a list of the citation of the particular article with a summary of what the article was about or what the results of the article were. That's not what a literature review is ultimately all about. What you're going to want to do is you're going to want to get as many articles as you possibly can, and then begin first and foremost by organizing them together by relevant topic. So, if your research study is relatively straightforward, like the relationship between sleep and GPA, maybe you're going to be listing a few articles that focus on sleep, maybe a few articles that focus on GPA. But the more complicated and the more complex your research studies tend to be, there might be more subdivisions that you're going to want to organize all of your literature reviews into, right? If you're doing something for an organization, let me take for example my doctoral dissertation, which was about deploying geopolitical analysts abroad to the countries about which they were reporting. So I talked about organizational expansion as sort of an offshoot of the notion of forwardly deploying the individuals to these foreign countries. I talked about issues with regard to security. So I talked about virtual private networks and everything like that. I talked about precautions being taken so that these geopolitical analysts aren't mistaken for individuals engaged in espionage or anything like that. I talked about bureaucratic theory and how to structure an organization based on this sort of thing. I talked about foreseeable problems with deployment, like individuals getting homesick and things like that. So, your literature review isn't necessarily limited specifically to the particular variables that you're going to be researching directly, not just your main independent and dependent variables, but anything that might be incidentally related or that might be related in terms of actually getting something off the ground, especially with regard to applied research. Okay, so those are a couple of things to keep in mind. And of course, you want to organize articles together as much as possible. Okay, now let's move on to the actual rubric itself. So the first and foremost, for my projects now across the board, I used to have a lower requirement in an introduction to research methods class than I would for an advanced research methods class. But I've decided that you probably want to have quite a few articles regardless of the actual level that the class is, and how much more effort does it take to get 15 articles rather than 10 articles. So I figure every class of mine now requires 15 articles to be cited. And of course, like I said, grouped together in a way that makes logical sense. So the organization and the actual article count are a big component of it, because you want to have a sufficient amount of references. You want to have a sufficient background as to the theoretical frameworks that guide this sort of research, and really come to an understanding of what has been done previously in relation to the variables that you're going to be researching, so that first and foremost you don't reinvent the wheel. You don't want to do things that have already been done and researched ad nauseum. But at the same time, just to get a good bit of background information and to be able to frame any arguments with regard to what hasn't been researched, right? If you see an article about employment status and how it affects your GPA, well, maybe there's going to be a bunch of articles out there that talk about nursing students working in the nursing field as they get their GPA versus business students working and getting their masters in business administration or their bachelors in business administration, right? Those narrowly researched topics do have direct relevance to what you might be researching. So if you're doing something with the social sciences, social science students working, either in the field or any job in particular, there might be some differences with regard to the type of work that's being done. And so, you want to have this breadth and this depth of the types of articles that are kind of out there so that you can really understand the background, really understand the theories that drive the observations, or rather, I should say the observations that drive the theories that you would then be trying to examine in a particular set of circumstances, whether it be an environment or specific groups or what have you, right? You can look at Cal State Long Beach in particular, or the state of California or the state of Alabama, or whatever it is that you want to look at, and really narrow down the focus of your research, informed by the 15 other articles that you've read prior to engaging in the study. Okay. Second, summarizing the findings. So yeah, as I mentioned in discussing citations and things like that, a big part of the literature review is indeed to summarize the findings, as you would with a annotated bibliography. So you do have to extensively summarize the findings of each article, including the ways in which the article is set apart from the articles of other articles that you've also looked at, such as by demographics or other characteristics. Okay, so you want to get in there, and it's mostly focused on the findings, less so the methodology or the literature review that they performed or anything like that. It's all about the findings. What were the results? What were the relationships between the independent and dependent variables that were explored? And how did that frame the theories generated or refined as a result of the research that was conducted? Okay, so that's just part one. If you do an annotated bibliography on 15 articles, that's it. You're still missing out on 1, 2, 3, 4 different sections, so you're probably not going to like the grade that you get if you stop it right there. Okay? Very, very central to a literature review, and what really sets it apart from something like an annotated bibliography is that you're linking the articles that you've researched to the hypothesis. Okay? So you want to make sure that your paper identifies how the article is similar and different to the study that you just read, to that particular article. So first and foremost, how is what you are doing your research on similar to, and how is it different from the article that you've just read? Okay? Then you want to discuss how the findings agree or disagree with the hypothesis. So hopefully, by the time you're done with your literature review, you will have a hypothesis set in stone that you're going to state unequivocally, either at the beginning of the literature review, towards the end of your introduction, or at some point, here in the context of this entire endeavor. Okay, and you want to discuss whether or not your hypothesis meshes with the findings of the articles. Okay, and I mean every single article, each one of the 15 articles. Is there agreement? Is there disagreement? And then, of course, in discussing that, you also want to discuss why you're going to expect a similar or different result. Why is it that your hypothesis is different? Why is it that your hypothesis is the same to the findings? And what are the core basic elements that are going to lead you to a similar result or to a different result, depending on the level of agreement. Okay, so that's very, very central to the literature review process, actually tying it in with the research that you're going to be doing. Okay, another big component of that is to find other variables that are related to the study. You want to discuss any other variables in the articles that you've read that might be important to control for or otherwise measure in your own study, right? If you're doing sleep and GPA, sleep is not the only variable that affects GPA. And if the only thing you're looking at is sleep, you're probably missing out on a lot of relevant discussion. How many hours a person studies, how socially active they are, whether they're sick, whether they have a family, whether they live at home or on campus maybe. These are all things that might potentially affect their GPA, and you want to bring in as many of those variables into your own study as what you see in some of the articles out there. And you want to, at the very least, be able to control for those variables. Eliminate the influence of how many hours of studying a person does and its effect on the GPA, so that you can isolate that sleep variable and really start to make sense of it. Okay. You really want to make sure that you discuss why you're either going to include or not include some of the variables that are discussed in those articles, right? It's perfectly fine to say, okay, well, this article also talked about the number of hours of studying and how it affects GPA, not just sleep. But I'm not going to be including this because of X, Y, and Z. Or I am going to be including it because of Z, Y, and X. So you want to be very, very specific with regard to all that information. Okay? And then, of course, spelling and grammar. You gotta. Hopefully, students that are watching this are college students by now. You should be getting it right with regard to your spelling and grammar at this point. I mean, you've had 12, 13 years, if you count kindergarten, of education prior to getting to college. You should be able to string together a sentence without too many mistakes. Now, of course, you make minor mistakes. Everybody does that. But if it's consistent, you're going to have to go back and figure out a way to make sure that you improve your writing and your spelling and everything like that. Okay? And then, of course, last but certainly not least, as I have emphasized over and over again, citations in the appropriate format. I suggest for social scientific research, ASA or APA citation. I'm open to other citation formats personally, but you want to be consistent, and you want to have both the in-text and the references section at the end as well. So you want to be citing topics as you're discussing them in the text of the literature review, as well as at the end of the references section. So you want to make sure that you're citing everything from which you've obtained any information. So, general ideas that are discussed in articles have to be cited. But in particular, anytime you're citing a statistic, you're quoting anything, those absolutely need to have citations. And as an educator and as somebody that is very much focused on conveying the importance of not plagiarizing, to have a direct statistic being cited that 43% of American adults do X, Y, and Z, and then not have a citation after that is really really unfortunate, because that's very specific information that you would not have come up with on your own, and chances are that you would have had that in the if you did collect that information on your own, you would have had that in the context of some sort of a database of information that you've collected your research on, so you'd at least cite that database. All right, so you always want to cite everything that comes from somebody else. Anything that's anybody else's idea, you want to go ahead and cite that. If it's something that you're pulling off the top of my head, top of your head, I should say, then yeah, that's fine. That's not a problem. Like you can say, maybe many students at, this particular university have been witnessed doing X, Y, and Z. Okay, that's not something that comes from a direct source. You don't necessarily have to cite that. But, anything that somebody else talks about, you're going to have to make sure that you give them credit for it. And with that, the literature review is pretty much ready to go. You have all 15 articles cited, you summarize everything, you link it to the hypothesis, you discuss the other variables, you make sure everything's cited correctly. With 15 articles, you're probably going to have at least 4 pages for the literature review, perhaps even more. You can always have more than 15 articles cited, absolutely. I believe my doctoral dissertation had about 130 different articles cited or so. It can get really comprehensive depending on the type of research that you're conducting, so make sure that you do everything that is required of all the articles that you do wind up using. With that, best of luck to you in putting together a literature review.